Yeah, hot spot.
Keep her under control.
And then I don't have that door keep coming up open.
Keep her under control. Your fault. Your fault.
This was a small one.
I told him, I said, Pete. I said, I guess we ought to vote this to 6.
I need to, done. Limited needs to see.
That's what my mama said. She said, y'all don't have it at 7. I said, no. We just don't be up in our patio like sardines.
Like I said, my makeup on good.
What's that?
Is my makeup on?
Oh, you looking good.
Did a rush job today.
Did a rush job.
Yeah, I'm running, trying to get to go feed cows first.
Did you say go feed cows?
I had to go feed the cows.
Are you serious?
Oh yeah.
You do all that, huh?
In the evening, I had to go with Jimmy. Basically, I kind of opened the gate and I just feed the calves. He feed the big one. Just put out a hay. He doesn't trust me with the.
How many head y'all run?
Huh?
How many head y'all run?
We're doing about 50 now.
Yeah.
We're not running that.
Enough to play around with?
Yeah, enough to tax right off because
Oh,
he has
yeah.
all that and keep it pasture land.
Yeah.
But I tell you what, there's not too many people running. The way hay went up
Yeah.
from $35, $40 a bale to 100, 100 and
Oh,
plus
man.
a bale. We're gonna run out. Great, I got a special.
How many sign-up sheets do we have?
Turn yours on. Oh. What time is it?
It's 6.
It's 6. I'm looking at that fake 3 minutes. Get to take it out. It's 6 now. It's 6 o'clock. Good evening. Our meeting is now called to order. We're open with an invocation and a pledge. Think we need a little Jesus? I'll pray. Dear Father in heaven, we thank you for this opportunity. We thank you for all of those that have come together. And as a city, we know that it's important that we take care of business. You're a God of order, and you're a God of wisdom and knowledge. And Lord, we ask you, and you give us the wisdom and knowledge that we need to accomplish the task. And Lord, we just thank you for what you've done for the people of this city, and we ask that you continue to bless them as they leave. And we ask that as we leave here, that we will accomplish what you would have us accomplish. And we give you the praise and the glory. In Jesus' name, amen.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
At this time, we would just like to once recognize all of you for coming. As visitors, we ask that you not let this be your last time. That as part of the city, you're welcome always to all of the meetings, and the more the merrier, so to speak. We'll be able to hear what everyone feels and are concerned about, and that's what running a city is all about. And we don't have anyone at this time that has signed up to have a special presentation or a word, but we will move to the comments from the council if there are any at this time.
The only thing I want to say, Mayor, in reference to this report, and I spoke with you and I spoke with Mr. Engelstein, let him know that this whole report was out before council had a chance to look at it, all on Facebook, the entire thing. So that's all I want to say.
Okay. Since no procedures were violated in the sense that it was a preliminary, it wasn't the official report, but when it went out to the council, it was in the hands of the council. If they chose to share, they were allowed to share it in that sense, but it wasn't anything that legally stopped it from being shared. So that was the reason it was shared. So does any of the other council have anything to say? If not, we'll move down to item number 1, the business. Item number 1 is the presentation, forensic audit report of the Crockett Economic and Industrial Development Corporation by Weaver and Tillwell, LLP. Good evening.
Yeah, good evening, Madam Mayor, members of council. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
May I
Check that. Be sure it's turned on, please.
May I make a statement right before you turn it? Is it on?
Check.
No.
No. Well, while he's checking on his mic, I forgot to kind of lay some ground rules. While he's talking, it's not open for discussion. Because there are a lot of us in here today, if I feel, as the one in charge of the meeting at this point, that it's getting too loud, I'll just basically raise my hand and give you an opportunity to lower it. And if you fail to lower it, we will ask that you step out and finish your conversation, not in this chamber. But you get to talk as loud as you like.
Thank you. Is that better?
The louder, the better.
Okay. My name is Travis Kastner. I'm a managing director with Weaver, and I've also got my colleague Michael Taylor. So we're here to present the findings for the forensic audit that we completed. We started this process in September, and we submitted the report last week. And so this is, we've prepared a PowerPoint presentation that will summarize what was in the report, and we'll be sharing that on the screen. But you know, the detail of our findings and is really what's laid out in the report itself. So if there are any questions from council at this time, we'll go ahead and get started with talking about the findings of the report. So first, just to talk through the work steps that we performed as part of the forensic audit. We conducted interviews with 11 individuals, and this includes both CEIDC employees, both current and former board members, and as well as city personnel. We also spoke with a representative from the financial audit firm that does CEIDC's annual financial audit. We reviewed and analyzed the audited financial statements as well as the annual budgets, and our review period was for the fiscal years 2010 through 2022. We analyzed bank statements for all transactions and reconciled those to the general ledger, including reviewing all of the check images for all of the transactions during the review period, which are attached to the bank statements. We also analyzed the check register to identify any missing checks, which we'll talk through in more detail. And as far as reviewing expenditures, we analyzed all expenditures, which included 3,300 transactions totaling approximately $12.2 million. We also reviewed.
So hold that thought.
I apologize.
Oh, now.
Is that better? Okay. Okay. I didn't think it was loud, but I was, no one said anything, so I was like, well, okay. We also looked at employee compensation and reconciled each employee's salary and other compensation to their W-2s. The interviews that we conducted covered, as I mentioned, both employees, board members, and individuals from the city. And also wanted to point out, too, that a lot of the information we received came from CEIDC, and they were, cooperative and working. There was a lot of information that was provided from CEIDC to us as part of this review. So, I would say thousands of documents were provided through this process. We also looked at loan agreements, performance incentives. We analyzed all of the credit card expenditures as well as the expense reimbursements during the review period, which included travel, other purchases. We evaluated the purchasing and procurement practices for CEIDC, and then we reviewed all of the records related to the 158 board meetings during the 12-year period, including the notice of public meetings, the meeting agendas, meeting minutes, the audio recordings, and then the items related to the executive sessions, including executive minutes and certified agendas. So that's wanted to lay out the work that was performed. This is in relation to the scope of work that was laid out in the RFP. It's detailed in the report. I did not include a slide, but I'm happy to go through the scope of work if that would make sense at the end of this. So now going into the summary of findings, these are as they're laid out in the executive summary of the report. The first one relates to budget amendments. So we did not, other than a budget amendment from June of 2010, we did not identify any budget amendments that were prepared or submitted to the city during the review period. We did note that for each of the fiscal years during this period, there were expenditures that exceeded what the budget amounts were for certain line items that would have warranted budget amendments. The process that was followed by CEIDC was that for each meeting, the board reviewed the financials for the month and year to date and approved them, and that was the process. But there wasn't formal amendments that were prepared and presented to the city since the June 2010 budget amendment. As I mentioned, we looked at all of the bank statements that are in support of the 3,300 transactions during this period. And we were able to obtain all of the bank statements with the exception of 6. So there were 6 that were either missing entirely or incomplete. And as a result of those 6 months that we didn't have bank statements, there were 99 payments that we were identified in the general ledger that totaled approximately $450,000, where we did not have supporting check images. So for the other 3,300 or so, we were able to identify the transaction in the general ledger, look at the supporting check image so that we can confirm where the payment went to. For these 99, we did not have check images, and the table shows which months you can. There's January 2014 and then September 2017 are the range that the 6 months fall in. So, just wanted to. That was one of the areas in the RFP was to identify any missing records. So that's why we listed those. Next, this finding relates to missing checks. So we ran several analytics through the general ledger, through the check register, through the reviewing the check images to identify any checks that appeared to be missing based on a sequence analysis. So we initially identified 24 checks that were not mentioned either in the GL or in the bank statements. And then after further discussion with CEIDC, we determined we received 2 letters. The first was a signed letter from 2021, which related to 17 of the 24 checks that it appeared were pre-signed by the board secretary and treasurer, and the letter essentially indicated that they were being returned to Mr. Gentry and being held in his office at that point. And my understanding from talking to Mr. Gentry is that the board secretary and treasurer there were some checks that were pre-signed in 2021 as a result of some health-related issues, and so there were essentially this letter was documenting the return of those 17 checks, and my understanding is that they've been voided and they're being secured, held in a locked drawer in Mr. Gentry's office. And then with an additional 6 checks, there was a letter dated March of 2022 that essentially stated that there were 6 checks that were being held in Mr. Gentry's office. So I guess those 2 letters account for 23 of the 24 checks, and then there was one other check from 2012 that we can't tell where that check is. It may have been destroyed. We just don't have any records or documentation related to that check. We've done these kind of presentations a few times. Sometimes it is easier to ask questions throughout if there's certain things that if you want to ask instead of waiting till the end. I won't take offense because it is easier to go through it. So if you have anything related to the slides, please feel free to interrupt me and I can stop. The next slide relates to compensation. So as part of our review of employee compensation, what we identified was that there was a pattern during the review period where certain compensation items were paid directly by CEIDC to the employees as opposed to the standard payroll process, which was where the city pays employees and CEIDC reimburses the city. So specifically, we identified the monthly auto allowances that were paid to prior executive directors. We also identified temporary living allowances for prior executive directors. We identified bonus payments and then severance payments, and then there were certain salary payments for the first few months of an employee's tenure that were all paid directly, from CEIDC rather than through the city. A large portion of this, and we'll detail this on the next slide, but a large portion of this compensation was not reported on any of the W-2 or 1099 tax forms or included the deductions for payroll taxes and retirement benefits. So this slide details the compensation paid directly. So what we've identified in total was $144,255 in payments during the review period. Of that amount, we determined that $118,622 was not reported on either a W-2 or a 1099, and then we've detailed that out by each of the 6 employees, and that's what's reflected on this table. So it shows the type of compensation. The majority of this relates to Mr. Tom Lambert in auto allowances and temporary living allowances during his tenure. And then Suzanne Steed received bonuses and severance pay that was also not reported on W-2s. So, and this, again, is further detailed in the report and the appendices, but this is kind of a summary of that finding. We also identified certain compensation items where there did not appear to be authorization in the form of a formal board resolution. So the first item, Christmas bonuses that were paid to Mr. Lambert and Ms. Steed during fiscal years 2013 through 2016, which totaled $32,000. We identified for prior years, for fiscal years 2010 through 2012, there was a formal board resolution that the bonuses were authorized to be paid by the board, but for starting in fiscal year 2013, we didn't identify board resolutions for those Christmas bonuses. With respect to the temporary living allowance that Mr. Lambert received, he was paid for almost his entire tenure from 2010 through December 2015. The temporary living allowance was around $350 to $400 a month, totaled $26,049 during his entire tenure. What we determined was that the board had only authorized temporary living allowances through July of 2012, and then the portion that was subsequent to that we've categorized as being unauthorized was $15,568. So there was a board resolution in 2011 to extend the temporary living allowance for 1 year, and subsequent to that 1 year, it basically continued throughout Mr. Lambert's tenure, and that was in the form of essentially credit card payments that were made to the Crockett Family Resort, where his trailer lease space was being paid on his behalf. And then Mr. Gentry received a performance incentive bonus of $8,400, which was paid in 2 payments in August 2020 and October 2020 without written authorization from the board. And we have more detail on the specifics for this on the following slides.
I have a question.
Yes.
Economic Development have a board that approve that, and I know they can go up to a certain amount. So where is it in written that has come before the board for the board to approve it, the city?
For compensation, my understanding is that any bonuses or compensation items are required to be approved by the board. Is that? Yeah, the CEIDC board. So not city council, but
Okay.
the board for CEIDC should be approving any of the bonus payments related to employees or other compensation.
Does that compensation have to come through the city, or can it go directly from the EDIC?
So, well, I don't know if there's a requirement as far as state law that it needs to go through the city, but I think that the process that was in place was for the city to pay it such that the deductions and the payroll taxes and the retirement benefits could be paid, and that was determined the best way to do that was to pay it through the city and have CEIDC reimburse. So I think that CEIDC could pay directly, but they would also need to make sure they're paying the required payroll taxes, deductions, and reporting the compensation and wages through a W-2.
Yeah.
But the process that was in place was for the city to administer that for those reasons. And the compensation that wasn't paid through the city, a lot of that was not reported on tax filings or didn't include the deductions for taxes and benefits. So on the last slide, we mentioned that there was not written authorization for the bonus that was paid to Mr. Gentry in 2020. This slide, we have the kind of the clip of the minutes of what the minutes reflect for that board meeting. And so item 7 is what it says, where it has, discuss and act on the evaluation of the executive director. It notes the board entered into executive session. It then says that the board approved executive director's evaluation and approved salary increase for executive director and his employees. And then, you see the signatures from the board president and board secretary treasurer. So what's recorded in the minutes refers to a salary increase being approved by the board, but not a bonus payment. And so that's, the first sentence that I said was that there was not written authorization. And so we dug deeper into this, and we have got a few more slides that go into our findings for that specific item. This slide lists the individuals who attended that July 15th, 2020 board meeting. So we have, at this point, talked to 4 of the 5 board members that were present. We talked to the Councilmember Jones, ex officio board member, Mr. Gentry, and then Mr. Angerstein, city administrator. So we attempted to interview the board president at the time, Mr. Von Doenhoff, and we were unable to conduct that interview due to some health matters. We spoke with Mr. Von Doenhoff briefly, as well as his member of his family, and yes, sir.
Well, I'll just wait until you finish, then I'll speak.
Oh, okay. And what we determined is that we were, due to some ongoing health-related issues that he was experiencing, we were, unable to really, complete an interview where we could rely on, that information. So we did talk to the other 4 board members, and then the other individuals that were present for that meeting. And then, we also noted here that Ms. McKnight, she was unable to attend that meeting due to, a health-related matter as well. And so, but we did try to get an account of the people that were there as far as whether there was authorization for the bonus. And then on the next slide, we've got some of the findings. And I guess one other point to make here, the way that the board meetings are recorded, there are minutes, and then there's audio recording for typically for the executive session portion of the meetings. And we received the audio recording for that meeting, and then what we determined after listening to it was that the meeting as it went into executive session, that was essentially the end of the recording, and so where we were hoping to get some clarity on the board reconvening into open session and getting the audio recording of any action taken by the board. That was not available to us, and so we don't have the audio of what was actually approved by the board. In talking to the individuals that we mentioned on the previous slide, we noted that there were 3 board members, 2 board members and an ex officio board member, Barkley and trustees Barkley and Thompson, and then the ex officio member, council member Jones, who their count was that the board unanimously approved the salary increase and the bonus payment, and then did not know why the approval was not recorded in the minutes. Another board member that we spoke to, Ms. Neal, her recollection was that there was discussion of a bonus payment during the meeting, but that she did not recall formal action being taken during the meeting. Another board member, Mr. Castleberry, said that he did not recall a bonus payment for Mr. Gentry being approved by the board. And then City Administrator, Mr. Angerstein, recalled that there was a board action for a salary increase, but not for a bonus payment. On this next slide, we've got a timeline of what happened after the July 15th, 2020 meeting. So on August 17th, 2020, Mr. Gentry prepared a check through QuickBooks for $4,200, which was at 6:04 p.m. So after regular business hours, which was the first of the 2 payments, and the check was, according to the image that we reviewed from the bank statements, Mr. Gentry did not sign that check, but it was signed by the board secretary and treasurer. On September 29th, 2020, the board president, Mr. Von Doenhoff, submitted a letter to the city regarding the board's approval of salary increases for CEIDC employees, which included Mr. Gentry as well as the 2 other employees, and referenced the salary increase of $5,000. But there was not any mention in that letter of a authorized bonus payment. On October 23rd, 2020, Mr. Gentry prepared the second check for $4,200 in QuickBooks at 6:34 p.m. After business hours, which was signed by both Mr. Gentry and the board secretary or treasurer. And in talking to the executive assistant, Ms. McKnight, she confirmed to us that these were, to her recollection, the only 2 payments that she did not enter into QuickBooks as far as preparing the checks, during her tenure, which goes back to 2018. On May 13th, 2021, the board ratified prior minutes with the language that it was the intent of the board to grant a bonus incentive to Mr. Gentry. So there was a ratification that showed that there was an intent, which is consistent with what Ms. Neal said, that there was discussion, but there wasn't her recollection was that there wasn't formal approval by the board. So there was that ratification that took place May 2021.
Excuse me. What line item was the $4,200 checks listed under? Did you recall that?
Yeah, so both payments of $4,200 were allocated to the auto allowance in the budget item. So there was $8,400 that was in the budget for auto allowance. In prior years, during Mr. Lambert's tenure when he was receiving an auto allowance, that was used to pay for that item. And then it hadn't been used in at least for a year or so, or several years, and then that was the budget item that was used for that payment. And we also noted too, we didn't include it here, but the first payment occurred during fiscal year 2020, and then the second payment was in October, so that would have been in fiscal year 2021. So there was, the 2 payments were split across fiscal years as well. Are there any other questions on that item? Okay. The next finding relates to severance payments without city approval. In August 2016, the CEIDC approved employment contracts for Flint Brent and Suzanne Steed. And from, at least during our review period, these were the first employment contracts that we had identified. So it didn't appear there were contracts that had been prepared up until that point. The following month, during the September 26, 2016 board meeting, Mr. Brent and Ms. Steed both submitted their resignations to the board, citing stressful work conditions. And during that board meeting, the board agreed to pay out severance as outlined in their contracts, which was some combination of 3 months' pay, 1 year's worth of benefits. I think Mr. Brent has included unused vacation time. In October of 2016, our understanding is that CEIDC had contacted the city and requested for them to pay the severance as approved by the board for Mr. Brent and Ms. Steed, and that the city refused after receiving guidance that the employees did not qualify for the severance as a result of their resignation versus, a unilateral termination, which was the provision, the qualifying provision in those contracts. So subsequent to the city indicating that they would not pay the severance, in October, November 2016, CEIDC circumvented the city's guidance and paid directly the severance to Mr. Brent of $21,485 and then to Ms. Steed for $17,679. We also identified that in December of 2016 that Mr. Brent had returned his entire severance amount back to CEIDC. With respect to Ms. Steed, we noted that none of the severance amount was reported on either a W-2 or a 1099. And then the following month, in January 2017, City Council voted to remove all of the CEIDC board members as a result of the severance payments being issued without approval from the city. The next item on this slide, so we've got a finding related to the hiring of Ponsetter Robbins, which occurred in February 2017. So during that board meeting in February, Mr. Gentry informed the board that he had hired Ms. Robbins as his executive assistant. We determined that Ms. Robbins is a first cousin to Mr. Gentry's spouse. Mr. Gentry informed Weaver during the forensic audit that this information, that he had disclosed this to the board, and but acknowledged that it was probably not on the record, or it may not have been during a board meeting, but there was awareness by the board of that relation with his spouse. For the first several months of Ms. Robbins' tenure, her salary was paid directly by CEIDC rather than going through the city's payroll process. So those salary payments totaled $5,235, and then we confirmed that those were not reported on either W-2 or payroll, and payroll taxes were not deducted. So that was another item where there was no tax reporting for that compensation amount. So the next expenditure that we reviewed as part of the forensic audit was credit card expenditures, and there were expenditures for, there was a card that Mr. Lambert had during his tenure, and then there was a credit card account for Mr. Gentry. So we've got a slide on both of those over the next two slides. But with respect to Mr. Lambert, his card was approved in November 2010. It was a Visa credit card account with a monthly limit of $5,000. Since the card's authorization in November 2010 through the rest of his tenure in December 2015, there were a total of around 700 credit card transactions, totaling around $92,000. So we requested the supporting documentation for all 700 transactions. We were unable to receive supporting documentation for 161 of those, which totaled about $17,800, or 19% of the total spend. The largest expenditures were in reference to what I mentioned earlier, the payments to for the monthly trailer space lease that were being paid through his credit card as part of the temporary living allowance, which totaled around $22,000. We also identified certain purchases related to spouse airfare and alcohol. The spouse airfare there was 2 trips to Chicago for an expo that his wife accompanied him, and so there were about $600 in credit card purchases, and at least one of those flights Mr. Lambert did repay. It was $222. The alcohol purchases were were at liquor stores. It appeared to be related to an open house event for the Cornerstone for the juvenile treatment detention facility. Had an open house in December 2013 and in 2014. So those were 2 of the questionable transactions. We didn't have one of our recommendations is that there isn't any guidance or guidelines as far as credit card use, but those were some of the ones that generally we see as being unallowable for in the government space. From our review of the credit card expenditures for Mr. Gentry, so he received the credit card in February 2018 upon board approval. This was through Prosperity Bank. It also had a $5,000 monthly credit card limit. We identified 600 transactions from February 18 through September 2022, totaling around $53,000. Similar to Mr. Lambert, we requested the supporting documentation for all 600 transactions, and we received all but 92 of for all but 92 of the transactions. We received supporting documentation. So the dollar total for those 92 was $5,896. So these were. I know there was a period from the early portion where there was less documentation available, but we went at least from what was able to be located and provided. We have all but 92 of those that we were able to review. The expenditures primarily related to purchases of office equipment, supplies both for office and maintenance, travel expenditures, membership fees for professional organizations, and then conference registration fees. Next, we reviewed all of the expense reimbursements that were paid by CEIDC to both employees and officers during the 12-year review period. So we identified the dollar amount was $24,504. This included 175 check payments and related to 305 expense itemized transactions. The amounts included 21,251 were reimbursements to 7 employees, and then 3,251 was reimbursements to 6 board members. These primarily related to travel, as well as some office supplies for purchases that were made by employees on behalf of CEIDC. And then we did not receive the receipts for 41 of the 305 transactions, which totaled $2,800. Next, we reviewed expenditures related to grounds maintenance and kind of the subcategory, the lawn maintenance. So this is a chart that shows for each fiscal year the total spend by year, and then we've got the colors essentially are totaled for each of the vendors. So there's a few observations we have on the following slide, but essentially, I guess to describe what we saw, there was multiple vendors that were utilized, from fiscal years 2010 through 2016, and then starting in fiscal year 2017, CEIDC primarily, contracted with Larry Robbins to do the grounds and lawn maintenance, going forward. We noted that starting in fiscal year 2020, the annual expenditures for Lawn maintenance doubled from $4,600 a year to around $9,500 a year, which it's been at that level for the last 3 years, which was kind of what those bars represented on the last chart. We also determined that Mr. Robbins was also a first cousin to Mr. Gentry's wife, as well as a sibling of Poncetta Robbins, who we talked about earlier, who was executive assistant during fiscal year 2017. We received all of the supporting invoices and backup documentation related to the lawn maintenance services provided by Mr. Robbins, and what we, in trying to determine the increase, or the cause for the increase in expenditures, it appeared that there was some additional properties that were being maintained, including the rail spur, and then there was some of the invoices indicated some work related to the cleanup after the February 2021 winter storm. Were what the invoices reflected. We also noted that the budget for the grounds maintenance increased from around $16,000 to $29,000 in fiscal year 2020. I'll just touch on this one real quick. Legal expenditures, we identified around $54,000 during the review period for legal expenditures. We noted that pursuant to CEIDC's bylaws, that the city attorney is authorized to serve as both attorney and counsel for CEIDC. So the majority of the $54,000 was paid to the city's attorney, Mr. Pemberton, who provided legal services from fiscal year 2010 through 2013, and then from 2017 through 2022. And during the interim time period, what we saw from the discussion in the board minutes was that the board president for CEIDC at the time, Mr. Von Doenhoff, was providing pro bono legal services to the board. He was a licensed attorney, and so they weren't paying the city attorney for legal services during that time period. We also noted that the budget for legal expenditures increased from like $1,000 to $10,000 in fiscal year 2018. During that, after Mr. Von Doenhoff was no longer on the board, and it was they were going to be paying this an outside provider to obtain legal services starting that time. With respect to the preparation of Form 1099s, entities are required to report any compensation given to non-employees that exceeds $600 during a calendar year, for non-employee compensation, this would be on a Form 1099 NEC. Prior to 2020, we determined that CEIDC did not prepare Form 1099s for vendors or contractors that received over $600. Starting in for the 2020 tax year, CEIDC engaged Axley and Rohde, who does their financial audit, and they did prepare the 1099s in 2020, but there were not 1099s for prior years. The next finding relates to CEIDC's lease of the Westbrook House. So for background purposes, CEIDC purchased the Westbrook House in 1999, which is also referred to as the Heritage House. In fiscal year 2010, CEIDC leased the house to the executive director at the time, Mr. Culp, to utilize as personal residence, which was the monthly rent was $300. The property, to our understanding, was then unoccupied or unused until about July of 2016, and then CEIDC leased the property to the Mary Allen Museum. It was a 15-year lease with it was a $1 per year lease amount, so $15 was paid by the Mary Allen Museum to CEIDC. We noted that under the terms of the lease agreement, that CEIDC was responsible for the structural integrity of the building, but we also noted that CEIDC had been paying Mr. Robbins to maintain the lawn and the grounds of the property throughout the term of the lease. And we also noted that Mr. Robbins was on the board of the Mary Allen Museum at the time. The next finding relates to the Small Business Relief Fund, where we have identified payments during fiscal years 2020 and 2021 that totaled $40,500 that was paid out to local small businesses. The original intent of this program was for the city to reimburse CEIDC once the city was reimbursed or received funding through the Coronavirus Relief Fund or the CRF grant. As part of this program, there was a task force that was formed with representatives from CEIDC as well as the city and Chamber of Commerce. And the payments were issued in two phases, with phase one in 2020 and then phase two in 2021. But during phase one, the task force received approximately 50 applications, of which they selected 40 businesses to receive $500 to help with financial losses incurred through the pandemic. The businesses were required to complete an application and then submit documentation showing how the funds were to be utilized. In the fall of 2020, the city was informed by the grant administrator, which was TDEM or TDEM, that the payments by CEIDC to the local businesses were not eligible for reimbursement under the CRF grant. And our understanding is that there was issues with to be eligible, there would have needed to be a contract in place with each of the recipients, so each of the local businesses. And so that was the funds were reimbursed to the city through other means, but for this specific payments, those were determined not to be eligible for those reasons. For phase one, the city did reimburse CEIDC for the $20,000 that were issued by CEIDC during phase one, which was paid from city's local funds. The following year, in March of 2021, Mr. Gentry informed the city that CEIDC intended to make additional payments to small businesses, which was going to total $20,000, and we're referring to this as phase two. We noted that there was less public awareness during phase two compared to phase one, and then there appeared to lack a formal structure as far as the selection process of the businesses. And the scoring for determining which businesses were to receive funds. We also noted that during phase two, when it was known that the payments were going to be coming from CEIDC and not through a grant, that the payments did not appear to be allowable under Chapter 501 of Texas Government Code. Specifically, there's a requirement for the funds from the Development Corporation to have performance agreements in place to award funds which are tied to job creation or job retention, and so that did not appear to be in place for these payments. Next, we reviewed and evaluated CEIDC's procurement and purchasing process. The CEIDC bylaws state that CEIDC shall follow and be bound by the same purchasing and contracting provisions of state law, including competitive bidding that are applicable to the city. We did not identify any formal competitive bidding procedures that were performed by CEIDC during the review period, such as RFP or an RFQ. We noted that the last RFP issued by CEIDC was in 2008, prior to our review period, which related to the general contractor for the construction of the tech center. We noted that we described the procurement process followed by CEIDC as an informal procurement process, where based on a review of the meeting minutes, the executive director would present one or more bids to the board for consideration. Typically, this was less than 3 bids or quotes, and we also noted that there was lack of documentation for the supporting documentation and quotes and bids received, such as evaluation forms or bid sheets. My understanding is that some of these were received by phone. There wasn't a whole lot of documentation that we identified to, other than the board minutes, which summarized that there were some quotes that were provided to the board, but there wasn't a formal RFP or RFQ. We identified the bylaws for CEIDC were amended 3 times during the review period. There was an amendment on June 8th, 2021, which related to changes with check signing authority. There was an amendment on August 1st, 2022 that expanded the audit period to extend it past 1 year. And then August 9th, 2022, which, there was a few things that I think the primary change was that it allowed for notice by email for board meetings. We did not identify that the amendments were for the August 9th, 2022 board meeting was approved. The August 9th, 2022 amendment did not appear to be approved by City Council, which was a requirement in CEIDC's bylaws. So the first 2, they were taken to Council for approval, and I think that the one on August 9th, 2022 has not been approved by City Council at this point. We also noted that CEIDC's loan agreement with the USDA from 2009 also had a requirement that any changes to CEIDC's bylaws were to be required approval from USDA, and that did not occur. So all 3 of the bylaw amendments, did not get approved by USDA during, as part of our review period. The next item relates to a loan between CEIDC and Prosperity Bank from 2014. We determined that there was a $1.5 million loan agreement in January 2014 related to the Cornerstone project. The agreement was secured by collateral assignment of sales tax revenues that were received by the city. But we noted that the city did not authorize a guarantee to assign sales tax revenue as collateral, which was inconsistent with prior CEIDC loans. The 2009 loan, for example, with USDA included, was presented to the city, and the city authorized a guarantee to use the sales tax revenue as collateral. There was also a loan agreement in 2004 with Citizens National Bank for $1.5 million that was formally guaranteed through the city's approval process. Through our discussions with Mr. Gentry and some of the other board members, I think there was an assumption that the 2004 guarantee may have transferred to the 2014 loan, but I think given that it was a different bank and there was a resolution that limited the guarantee to Citizens National Bank, which would have excluded the Prosperity Bank loan. So there didn't appear to be a formal guarantee for that. We did note in general that the city was supportive of the project, but again there wasn't a formal guarantee of the loan at that time. The next few findings relate to our review of the board meetings with respect to the Open Meetings Act. As I mentioned, I think at the beginning, that we identified 158 board meetings that occurred during our review period. We were unable to identify meeting agendas for 18 of the 158 board meetings, which all of those related to the 2010 through 2017 time period. We noted that for 40 of the 140 meetings, so I think these are the 158 minus the 18 that didn't have agendas, so the 140 that had meeting agendas, 40 of those did not have at the bottom where they have the signed certification of the board meeting. The notice of public meeting was posted on the Civic Center, in City Hall and the date and time. 40 of those were not signed. We noted that the board meeting on July 29th, 2020 was posted less than 72 hours in advance, which is a requirement through the Open Meetings Act and the Texas Government Code. I believe it was 54 hours or somewhere around there. We also noted that the meeting notices were not being posted on CEIDC's website, which may not be in compliance with Section 551.056 of Texas Government Code. I know talking to Mr. Gentry, they're working on a plan and getting the technological capabilities to do so going forward, but acknowledge that hadn't been being done up to this point. With respect to our review of the meeting minutes, so we did identify meeting minutes for all 158 of the board meetings. For 38 of the 158 meetings, we did not identify copies of the meetings that were signed by the board president and secretary, which those were from May 2013 through September 2017. We noted that 20 of the 158 meeting minutes did not include the time the meeting was called to order, and then 29 of 158 minutes did not identify the time that the meeting was adjourned. We also noted that the audio recordings of the board meetings was unable to be located. There were 2 recording devices that were maintained, all of the audio recordings going back at least until 2018. And so what when we requested for those audio recording devices, we were informed that the first one was able to be located, which had the older the older audio recordings, but the most recent meetings, the audio recorder was not able to be located, which is a requirement to maintain those audio recordings in the Open Meetings Act. The next slide talks about executive session. So we determined that the board met in executive session for 66 of 158 of the board meetings. The board does not maintain audio recordings for deliberations in executive session, and our understanding is that they will pause the recording and then go into executive session and then resume the recordings for any action taken or any subsequent action in open session. There were executive minutes that were maintained from 2010 through 2016, which included a detailed summary of the proceedings and deliberations during executive session. There were not executive minutes from fiscal years 2017 and forward. My understanding in talking to the current board president is that they've recently implemented a template where there's a form to maintain notes in a handwritten format for the deliberations in executive session. But again, for much of the period from 2017 through 2022, there's not audio recording, there's not notes, and which again gets back to the issue when we were looking at the July 2020 board meeting. There's nothing, there's no record, easily available record of the proceedings in executive session. 12 of the 66 minutes with executive session did not include the times the board entered into and adjourned from executive session. And then, certain of the meeting minutes do not provide sufficient detail as far as the actions taken after executive session, such as that July 15th, 2020 board meeting where, we would expect to see that a note in the minutes that the board entered into open session after going into executive session and took a vote and what the result was, but there was in some instances we noted that there was less detail regarding the actions taken after executive session. And that's the end of the findings portion. We've also, as included in the report, we've also listed some recommendations for internal controls and policies and procedures, and I'm happy to go through those now, or if this would be a good time to stop and answer answer any questions.
I just have a question since you finished that. You notice any money missing, stolen, or misplaced in your report? Was there any money missing, stolen, or misplaced?
The audio recordings, I think those would, at least the one recording device is unable to be located. We don't know, exactly where that is. I think that would qualify as, at least unable to be located.
I was speaking about money, sir.
Money.
Is there any money missing, any money missing, stolen, or misplaced?
I don't think there's any direct expenditure. I mean, I guess if there were some issues with not reporting of some of the compensation, but as far as we didn't include any findings related to fraud as far as like stolen. I mean,
So you said there was no fraud?
I can't say that's not an opinion.
No, that's something you just said.
No, so let me back up real quick.
Okay.
So the findings in here are based on the work performed, is outlined in this scope of work, and then we're presenting those findings. So the intent of this report and any report that I could even deliver as a certified fraud examiner is I cannot present any finding that says there is or is not fraud. And so just to start there.
So in looking at all these figures, you can say if there was any money missing from what you put together?
Well, what I'm saying is what we've identified is there's certain transactions that are in the summary of findings where we've outlined some concerns, and we in some cases, for example, if we're talking about the bonus payment for July 2020, we talked to everybody that we could. We viewed all the information available, but we can't determine, there isn't any conclusive evidence that shows there was an authorization for that payment, so we can't make any conclusion in that regard without that information being available.
Okay. I appreciate what you're saying, sir. That still didn't answer my question. You did a forensic audit on economic development, and you can't tell us there's money missing, stolen, misplaced. Did you notify the misplaced money, stolen money, or any of those three?
So
you did forensic audit. I'm just asking. I'm not making a.
Well,
right.
I think that the terminology, the stolen or misplaced, I think what the findings that we're showing is we have some areas where the use of the funds is where we have identified some concerns, and whether there's, again, the findings, we did not have a written authorization for these several bonus payments going back to 2010. So those were, potential misuse of funds because there was not proper board authorization for those payments.
Okay, you identified that, but that still don't tell us. You did this whole forensic report on economic development. I think the council should know if there is money missing from any of your findings.
Well, again, I think that the issue isn't that the money's missing. We know where it went. I think the issue is whether there was proper
So you say there's no
authorization.
stolen money? There's nothing missing in reference to your report?
What I'm saying is that there may be, some of these payments may be in violation of Texas government code and the policies of CEIDC as well as the city. And that's what we've identified as far as, the payments that should have had authorization that did not have authorization, the payments that should have been reported on tax forms that were not. Those are what we have identified, and we're not going to. Any certified fraud examiner, a fraud is something that's determined by a jury, and I cannot, or anyone in this room cannot make a determination about fraud. And so, if that's what you're getting me to say or not say, I'm not going to do that. But I will, go back to the findings that are detailed in the report is what we found. And I don't want to misstate that. The report speaks for itself.
Okay.
Well, we do have the $451,000 that are unaccounted for right now, correct?
So, well, those were with the check images.
Yes.
So those were those were payments that we identified in the general ledger, and we know where the money went to based on what the general ledger says. But as part of a forensic audit, we're trying to verify that because there is,
Of course.
and so we've requested all of the bank statements which have the actual check image as taken by the bank that shows where the payment went to. And so for those 99 payments, we didn't have the check image because the bank statements were either
So until we get the 6 missing bank statements.
Correct.
And copies of those checks, we won't know exactly how to match that up.
right. We can only rely on what's in the general ledger.
Right.
And I know that there was most of those are during earlier time periods. I think that they're in the process of requesting those from the bank. And I think that it's the bank, whether the bank has them or not, going back 10 years, I don't know, but I know that, they didn't have them at CEIDC's office, and then they were working to try to get those, from the bank.
So the checks that were in the office of the director, were they signed checks or were they?
So based on the 2 letters, so there was 23 checks, and I think the letter indicates that 17 of those were signed and then voided. They were returned to Mr. Gentry after they had been pre-signed, and then he essentially removed them from the queue of the checkbook, and those have been being held and voided. So they're not I think they're not going to be used, but those were some of the checks where we didn't identify them in the general ledger or the bank statements, and so we wanted to figure out where are they, and that's when we received the letter signed by Mr. Gentry and Ms. McKnight about that. The other 6, it didn't indicate in the letter whether they were signed or not, so I don't know, but I do know that those 23 are in Mr. Gentry's office and in a locked drawer.
Any other questions from the council?
So I will go through the recommendations if that makes sense.
Yes.
So based on the findings that we've outlined in the report, we've included recommendations for CEIDC's consideration. The first relates to training and education for both CEIDC employees and officers, and particularly related to Texas Government Code, purchasing and procurement requirements, Open Meetings Act, and related to the requirements related to keeping and recording of the minutes, the posting of the meeting notices and agendas. We think that would be beneficial for CEIDC. We also are recommending, or at least consideration for the formation of an ad hoc committee within CEIDC that's tasked with reviewing the bylaws and one, making sure that they're still in compliance with Texas Government Code. I think there's some areas that could be clarified. The ad hoc committees, from my understanding and reviewing the bylaws, can include individuals from CEIDC as well as the city, or even they don't have to be members of CEIDC. But we also recommend that there be work in tandem with legal counsel and really just ensuring that the bylaws are still aligned with Texas Government Code, and there's any need to be updates. Any updates would be recommended back to CEIDC and then City Council. We're also recommending that there be a process in place to formally prepare budget amendments for expense items when there's a budget to actual analysis and there is a need for an amendment that be formally prepared and presented to the city for approval. Similar to what happened in the June of 2010, where there was the last budget amendment. There was a process in place, and it appeared that process ceased, around that time. With respect to the administration of employee compensation, we're recommending that there needs to be a process to ensure there's consistency and then compliance with reporting requirements and deductions. What we observed was some payments were being paid directly by CEIDC without proper deductions and tax reporting, and others were being paid through the city. So that we're recommending that process be made consistent so that all of the compensation is treated in the same manner. We're recommending formal policies and procedures for expenditures, specifically procurement, competitive bidding, travel expenses, use of credit card, what's allowable, what's not. Currently, the CEIDC's policy relates to check processing, which walks through the processes for that, but doesn't really, there's not any detail about what's allowable and what's not. And so broadening, having a broader purchasing policy that relates to the allowable expenditures would be beneficial. The separation of QuickBooks user accounts. So we noted that currently there's one administrative account, and multiple individuals have access to that. And so having the ability to separate those accounts so that it's assigned to each user, which will allow for accountability and maintaining the audit trail record of the QuickBooks capability. The assignment of accounting function to an outside entity. So my understanding in talking to CEIDC is that within the last several years that they have procured services of a bookkeeping firm. I think that their services are somewhat limited, and I think there is would be benefit in broadening the services to the entire accounting function, including QuickBooks, and having one, it would allow for some segregation of duties with respect to the bookkeeping and the entries into QuickBooks, and if that is not feasible, even some kind of process where they provide supervisory services to CEIDC staff. Next, we've got the implementation of a centralized and secure electronic storage. So currently, there's not a centralized electronic storage. Most of the documents are hard copy. They're in boxes going back a number of years. So as a result, there's also may not be backups of a number of these documents, and there's some difficulty in locating them. So if there is a cost-effective secure centralized electronic storage, we think that would be beneficial for the record-keeping purposes for CEIDC. And then implementing a document retention policy, and I know that's something that Mr. Gentry had mentioned that they're considering, and currently there is not one. So again, they have boxes and boxes of documents going back to the formation of CEIDC in 1995, and so to the extent that they can formalize that process, will I think be beneficial to them as well, and so. That's the end of the recommendations, and again, there's more detail in the report, but this was intended to provide, a summary of the findings and recommendations.
Excuse me. One thing that you can observe, it was a good thing that as the council that they went back for a broader scope. We kind of debated about that. But what you could see that over the years, there's been a lot of bad practices, for lack of a better term. And I know at one point when when economic development was disbanded, the board, it would have been hindsight, it would have been a perfect time to go in and update the policies and make sure that everything was done in a systematic, legal, all those details that you had recommended. That would have been a prime time because they did start from scratch again, so to speak. And I guess the good thing about it is there are still some details that are going to have to be addressed, but you did see that it was just a series of practices that weren't functional that were passed on, and they were continuously passed on, and they were never stopped. Is that a good thing? No, it's not a good thing, but is it something that happens when you have an opportunity to correction and you fail to make those corrections, it appears that it's okay. And so I know that there are a lot that bear the responsibility of those things that have happened, and it's the council responsibility to ensure that they don't continue to happen in terms of what it is. So at this point, like I said, I think the value of the audit was really good to give us just a broad sense of how things should have happened, where they kind of went astray. And we do appreciate the hard work that you did with it. And at this time, we're just entertaining any questions from the council or concerns.
Good job.
I have one question on that, on the CRT. Was that two different grants or what have you? Or was
For the-
it one that was reimbursed?
So there was two phases of payments. So the original plan was for the funding to come from the CRF grant, but ultimately the TDEM determined that was not eligible under that grant, and so during phase one, the city did reimburse CEIDC for $20,000. It was 40 businesses that each received $500. And then the following year, once it was known at that point that these were not going to be funded through the grant, but Mr. Gentry informed council that he was going to use CEIDC funds to administer an additional $20,000 to 40 businesses, and then it was, so essentially the first $20,000 was effectively paid, through the city's funds, and then the second $20,000 was paid from CEIDC's funds, and so the grant funds never ultimately were applied to those payments.
So we never got any grant money for that.
Not for those. My understanding is that there was whatever the amount the city was allocated for the CRF grant was received, but it was for other items, but they weren't applied to the payments to the small businesses. And that's where we noted, though, that once the payments are coming from CEIDC, there is requirements for how those funds are used under Chapter 501 of, economic development corporations have certain requirements. And so that was where the finding was related to that, was that, there was not performance agreements in place with the businesses, which once it's determined the funds are not part of the grant but coming from CEIDC, then those would be applicable.
Does anyone else? Well, we do thank you
All right. Well,
for
thank
your
you.
audit, and we know where you live and know where to get it.
Thank you. Have a good night.
At this time, we're going to go into executive session because we have some legal questions to discuss in terms of what will happen next. And we do invite you. You can stay for the long haul, but you will be clear in this chamber while we have the discussion. And thank you so much.
Yeah.